Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, the opulent British ocean liner that struck an iceberg and sank. But it's likely you have never heard of the Cap Arcona, a German version of the Titanic. Before World War II, the vessel was a cruise ship for the well-to-do. By the end of the war, the Nazis had transformed it into a floating concentration camp. Packed with prisoners, the Cap Arcona was anchored in Lübeck Bay in the Baltic Sea when an aerial attack just hours before liberation killed nearly everyone on board. The ship's improbable journey from luxury liner to death trap is one of the most horrific and little-known war stories we have encountered.
The story will continue in a moment.
On sunlit days, Germany's Baltic coast looks idyllic, but this beauty masks an unthinkable horror, one that's etched in the local memory and on this beachside marker bearing the name Cap Arcona and the German words for fear, panic, and grief.
It's so calm, so peaceful, and yet out there is a graveyard. You can come to a place like this and just feel the weight of the history.
British historian Bill Niven has spent much of his career studying the Holocaust. We met him at Lübeck Bay, where the memory of the Cap Arcona and a smaller cargo ship bombed on May 3, 1945, still haunts this shore. What is this place?
This is a memorial, an honorary memorial to the victims of the two ships that went down with a loss of some 7,000 lives. It recalls all the nationalities that were victims of the sinking of the ships.
There were Americans on the ships.
Yes, there were Greeks, there were Italians, and the Jewish people, of course, represented here by the Star of David.
Most of the victims were on the Cap Arcona. Every year on the anniversary of the attack, a somber ceremony is held at this site to remember those who perished and those who suffered.
My father was one of the survivors of the sinking of the Cap Arcona.
Bruno Neurath Wilson came to honor his father Willie, a political prisoner held on the Cap Arcona. Only about 400 prisoners survived the attack, including Bruno's father. What's it like for you to be in this place?
When we go to the place where the Cap Arcona sank, I try to imagine what happened. I really cannot imagine what happened on the ship.
No one could have imagined this end for the Cap Arcona. Launched with great fanfare in 1927, the ship became known as the Queen of the Atlantic, transporting well-heeled passengers from Europe to South America in 2 weeks. What was it like in its heyday?
Well, it was one of the most beautiful ships the Germans had. It had its own tennis court. It had a heating swimming pool. It had the most wonderful restaurant where you could look out onto the sea. The most wonderful first-class cabins.
It was a luxury.
It was a luxury cruise liner. Absolutely was.
The Cap Arcona traversed the Atlantic dozens of times, but in 1933, Germany underwent a sea change. Adolf Hitler came to power. In 1939, as German troops invaded Poland, the Nazis commandeered the Cap Arcona to serve as a floating barracks in the Baltic. Ironically, on one of its last trips before the war, the ocean liner carried some German Jewish passengers who had bought tickets to safety in South America. But most Jews had no way to escape.
We were rounded up and sent to the concentration camp. Just the three of us, my mother, I, and my younger brother.
94-year-old Manfred Goldberg was just 11 when the Nazis forcibly removed him and other Jews from his hometown of Kassel in central Germany. He would survive confinement in the Riga, Latvia ghetto and 4 different concentration camps.
The cruel experiences during my young years, between 11 and 15, they're firmly lodged clearly in my mind to this day.
In Nazi-held Latvia, Goldberg, his mother Rosa, and other prisoners were forced to repair bombed-out railroad tracks during the day. When they returned to camp one night, they learned the SS had taken Manfred's little brother Herman and 3 other children. they were never seen again.
They just disappeared off the face of the earth. The next morning, both my mother and I had to line up and go to work as though nothing untoward had happened.
What did that do to you and your mother?
I was nearly as heartbroken as my mother at the loss of her little baby, so to speak. He was 7 when he went into the camps and 9 the day he disappeared.
Goldberg and his mother ended up in the Stutthof camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. Another young boy, George Schwab, was imprisoned there too.
The crematoria, burning of bodies all the time, gassing, terrible.
Schwab is 92, but he was only 9 when German soldiers invaded his hometown of Liepaja, Latvia. Schwab's father, a prominent physician, tried to protect other Jews in town.
He noticed SS trucks were approaching, and he waved for fellow Jews to disperse. And they arrested him, knocked out one eye, threw him down the cellar, and then killed him.
Bruno's father, Willy Neurath, was not Jewish, but he actively opposed the Nazi regime.
My parents belonged to the small minority of German people who fought against the Nazis. They didn't fight with weapons, of course.
Fight with their words.
Yes, fighting with papers, with printed papers.
Willy was arrested for distributing anti-fascist flyers.
They brought them to Buchenwald, and from Buchenwald they brought him to the concentration camp Neuengamme by Hamburg.
The Neuengamme work camp mostly held political prisoners. Inside this massive warehouse, historian Bill Niven told us, prisoners like Willy Neurath made bricks.
What does it feel like to walk in here?
It feels like a factory of death. You can sense what went on in this place.
But this was not a death camp. This was a work camp.
It's a very, very slim distinction. During the course of this work, they die. They die in droves.
Willy Neurath managed to survive, but as fate would have it, he, Schwab, the Goldbergs, and the Cap Arcona all would end up at Lübeck Bay, one of the last Nazi defensive positions. In 1945, as the Allies were closing in, the Cap Arcona, now rusted and battered, was repositioned to Lübeck Bay. At the same time, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler ordered the evacuation of concentration camps.
Why were they trying to clear these places out?
There is an order by Himmler that no prisoner is to be delivered into the hands of the enemy alive. But I think the main concern was to get rid of evidence, because prisoners are evidence. They can talk, they can tell, they can speak to those atrocities that were committed by the Nazis. So getting rid of the evidence meant getting rid of human beings.
Thousands of prisoners were sent to the Nazi holdout at Lübeck Bay. Willy Neurath was forced north from Neuengamme, about 50 miles. From Stutthof in the east, Manfred Goldberg, his mother, and George Schwab were sent to a nearby town aptly named Hell and put on barges.
What were the conditions?
Oh, terrible, just beyond description. No toilet facilities, hardly any food. You could hardly sit, you could certainly not sleep.
Sounds like hell.
Hell on earth, absolutely.
The barges, each packed with about 1,000 prisoners, were towed by tugboat for 6 days, about 400 miles across the Baltic, to where the Cap Arcona was positioned. The Cap Arcona arrived in Lübeck Bay on April 14, 1945, 2 weeks before Hitler killed himself and 3 weeks before the end of the war in Europe. It was anchored out there, about 2 miles offshore. With its engines barely running and little in the way of food and water, the former Queen of the Atlantic, a playground for the rich and famous, was about to become a floating concentration camp. With nowhere to hold the amassed prisoners, SS guards jammed more than 4,000, including Willy Neurath, onto the Cap Arcona.
And one must remember this is a ship that's meant for 1,500 people. It's not meant for 4,000 to 5,000 prisoners.
Do we know what the Nazis intended to do with the prisoners on the ship?
I think they intended them to die.
Prisoners already were dying on the barges fleeing Stutthof, carrying Schwab and the Goldbergs. Once in the bay, The SS guards uncoupled the tugboats, leaving the prisoners adrift. They just abandoned you.
Abandoned. We were left alone, supposedly on minefields.
Schwab and Goldberg told us mixed in with the concentration camp victims were a few prisoners of war. They had been better fed and better treated, and they seized the opportunity.
They managed to prise loose some very long floorboards and began using these planks of wood as oars, and they rowed in that manner into the night. Shortly before dawn, the barge ran aground.
Norwegian prisoners on George Schwab's barge took advantage of the wind blowing toward shore.
They came and collected the blankets that we had and made sails, and we managed to sail towards land.
Near death but desperate to live, Schwab and the Goldbergs found the strength to climb out of their barges, only to be intercepted by the SS and German troops on the beach, who shot and killed many prisoners on the spot.
And we felt practically certain that we would be shot next. But instead, they lined us up into a column.
We were told that we were going to be shipped to a liner by the name of Cap Arcona.
And while we stood there, we saw quite a large number of bombers, aeroplanes, moving overhead.
The Cap Arcona was in the bombers' sights. The war was nearly over, but the prisoners' ordeal was not. That part of the story when we come back. At the beginning of May 1945, the war in Europe was all but over. Adolf Hitler was dead, German forces were in retreat, and the Third Reich was crumbling. One of the last Nazi defensive positions was at Lübeck Bay in the Baltic Sea, where German ships fled, seeking safe harbor, including the Cap Arcona, a luxury ocean liner commandeered by the Nazis for the war effort. As the Allies closed in, the SS evacuated concentration camps and packed thousands of prisoners onto the Cap Arcona.
The story will continue in a moment.
Around noon on May 3, 1945, 13-year-old George Schwab was ordered to line up to board the ship.
But the Cap Arcona could not come close to shore because it was a large liner.
Big ship.
So we were going to be transported to the Cap Arcona by another ship. I was in the back of the line. I was in no hurry.
You purposely got to the back of the line?
Back of the line.
He was at a dock near this German naval base where Manfred Goldberg and his mother were lined up too.
And it is while we stood there that we witnessed bombers and fighter planes coming along.
Could you see any markings on the plane?
No, we had no idea what nationality they were.
You could see the planes coming in.
We could see the planes clearly.
You
we could see the bombs dropping.
Can you remember what it sounded like?
There were some pretty powerful explosions, and there were quite a few.
The Cap Arcona was hit. With more than 4,000 prisoners on board, the floating concentration camp became a fiery tomb. In a hard-to-believe turn of events, the attackers were British Typhoon fighters like these, part of the Allied forces moving in to finish off the Nazis. The British came to liberate these prisoners.
They did, yeah.
And ended up killing thousands of them. It's like horror on top of horror.
It is, and yet some of them did survive to remember it.
Bill Niven is a British historian and scholar of the Holocaust. He told us the mistaken attack on the Cap Arcona and a smaller ship is one of the most wrenching tragedies of the war.
The prisoners knew that the war was nearing its end. I think a lot of them probably had hopes that they would survive, and that gave them the strength and the courage to hang on.
At the Cap Arcona Museum in the town of Neustadt by Lübeck Bay, he described the attack. British typhoons struck in waves. The Cap Arcona was hit around 3 p.m.
Do you have any idea how many bombs were dropped on the ship?
Some people say 60 or over 60. You can imagine the panic and the horror that broke out when the bombs hit the ship, especially for those concentration camp prisoners who were in the very lower decks of the ship, and they were unable to get up to the top because of the flames.
Was this the worst case of friendly fire in the Royal Air Force's history?
Quite probably, yeah.
Sebastian Cox is chief historian for Britain's Royal Air Force, the RAF. He blames the incident on the fog of war. Why was the Cap Arcona targeted?
Because the Allies believed that there was going to be an attempt to flee by certain Nazi elements across the Baltic to Norway and essentially continue the war.
Did the British military have any idea that concentration camp survivors were on the Cap Arcona?
If you mean, did the pilots have any idea? Absolutely not.
But other members of the British military did know.
What we learn from the records, that the British were handed two opportunities very close to the 3rd of May in regards to the placement of prisoners on board the ship.
Concentration camp prisoners on those ships.
Indeed.
Daniel Long wrote his PhD history thesis on the attack on the Cap Arcona. We met him at the British National Archives in London, where he showed us these fragile war documents.
This is the only official investigation that was carried out into the tragic sinking of the Cap Arcona.
Shortly after the bombing, a British war crimes investigator interviewed the intelligence officer for the squadrons that attacked the Cap Arcona and other ships in the bay.
The intelligence officer admitted on 2 occasions that a message was received on the 2nd of May, 1945, that the ships had been loaded with concentration camp prisoners.
That intelligence came in the day before the attack.
Which then leads to suggest that there was ample time to warn the pilots on the planes.
That information did not make it to the RAF pilots?
That's correct.
The report does not say why the intelligence officer failed to inform the pilots, but it did blame RAF personnel for the error and called for further inquiry. The report strongly urged that there be a follow-up investigation. That has never happened, has it?
Not to my knowledge.
Why not?
Attempting to, conduct a detailed investigation would in many respects be a little pointless. What are you going to conclude?
To find out what went wrong, what mistakes were made.
We know what happened. The RAF made a mistake. An individual made a very tragic mistake, and we know the consequences.
About 7,000 prisoners perished when the ships were bombed in the bay. Of the more than 4,000 on the Cap Arcona, only about 400 survived. Bill Niven told us several survivors later wrote accounts of the hell they endured at sea.
Im Raum waren Tausende von Gefangenen wie Heringe zusammen. Thousands of prisoners were packed together like herrings. Sie streckten die Arme hoch und schrien, ich will raus, ich will raus. So they stretched their arms up and they cried out, I want out, I want out. This is really quite terrible to have to read this. The fire suddenly got more and more intensive, and this was because the flesh of the prisoners was burning so strongly, it made this intensity happen. It's distressing to read.
Bruno Neurath Wilson's father, Willie, a political prisoner, was trapped on the ship when the bombs hit.
My father managed to go to the back of the ship where it was not burning, and there he survived because he couldn't swim.
He survived because he couldn't swim.
He did not jump into the water. And prisoners who jumped into the water were shot by the SS.
When the British realized their mistake, they dispatched rescuers who plucked Willie Neurath and others from the listing deck of the Cap Arcona and took them to shore. This is the stretch of beach where your father came ashore?
In this front of the beach, yes.
Bruno told us in an improbable twist of fate, his mother Ava, a naval staff assistant, had been transferred to the naval base at Lubeck Bay. When she saw the bombing, she was drawn to the beach.
She had only one hope, to know where is my husband, is he still living, and maybe my husband is on the ship.
How did they find each other?
She came from this direction and she saw a man coming towards her. She didn't recognize the one person she wanted to see.
He must have been thin and weak.
And dirty from the burning, but he came over to her and called his nickname he had for her, Muppel.
What does Muppel mean?
Muppel means something like, I love your round face. She recognized his voice by this one word, Muppel.
That ship was a graveyard for so many people, but yet it brought your parents back together.
Yeah, I don't know if there are hidden meanings in life, but one meaning can be that I am alive now and can tell about this story.
As for George Schwab, he pulled inspiration from the horror.
This is a prize for having helped Latvia get into NATO.
The native of Latvia moved to New York, earned a PhD in political science, and had an illustrious career as an academic and peace broker.
Here I'm with King Hussein,
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton. You know,
Dr. Schwab, I think you knew everyone.
somewhat.
Manfred Goldberg and his mother settled in London. She passed away in 1961. Goldberg married, started a business and a family. In 2017, he returned to the Stutthof concentration camp with the then Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. He has made it his life mission to share his story.
I consider that part of my revenge on the Nazis. They wanted to exterminate us, and here we are, not only having survived, we are now great-grandparents.
That's your revenge.
My revenge on the Nazis, yes.
The Cap Arcona lay half sunken in Lubeck Bay for 4 years before being dismantled. But the story has lain beneath the surface, little known beyond this Baltic coast. It's now tradition on the 3rd of May for families of victims and survivors to sail to the site where the ship was bombed. They want the world to remember.